Good morning, everyone. What is ordinary and what is extraordinary? If we were to summarize Jesus' life, most would say he was a great teacher. He did many miracles. He died and rose from the dead. We tend to think these things were ordinary for Jesus because we have heard them so often. We overlook that each of these elements of Jesus' life is exceptionally significant and is in fact extraordinary. If we assume we already heard the story, then that which is supposed to be extraordinary becomes ordinary and at times even boring. At first reading, we may think today's gospel is just another ordinary day in the life of Jesus. He heals a woman who was sick for 12 years, who had spent all her money trying to get better, who did not find anyone to help her, but Jesus heals her immediately. We assume, because we've heard this gospel, and we've heard similar gospels so many times, that that's normal for Jesus. So this great event does not move us in the same way that it should. Then today's gospel tells us that Jesus then went on to raise from the dead a 12-year-old girl. We sometimes overlook how extraordinary these are because we assume they are ordinary once again for Jesus. When we read the Bible, we always need to read it with fresh eyes. That is, read it as if we have never heard what we have just read before. We must realize that what we may have gotten used to seeing as ordinary is in fact extraordinary at so many levels. First, let's get surprised and excited that Jesus healed a woman who was sick for 12 years and then went on to raise from the dead a 12-year-old girl. Both within an hour. That's quite extraordinary. Let us also remind ourselves this is both extraordinary and very impressive. Let us also remind ourselves that Jesus did not just walk around trying to impress people, but he did these things to show us that God's love, mercy, and power is revealed through him. That would be amazing enough and could keep us marveled for a very long time. However, what Jesus did in his life not only is extraordinary, it is followed by a series of extraordinary events that are even more extraordinary. Therefore, we can say it is exponentially extraordinary, where extraordinary is multiplied by extraordinary, not just one extraordinary after the other. When we slow down to look at the nuances in today's gospel, we see an example of this extraordinary extraordinariness. In addition to Jesus showing power and love, today's gospel goes deeper by showing us Jesus' power and love shared equally with everyone, regardless of their social status. If we had slowed down, we may have missed this very important nuance in this gospel. And I will go on to explain why. We can only see this extra element by reading the text very carefully. Let's start with the first part where Jairus approaches Jesus. The nuances in this gospel are always important. St. Luke tells us Jairus is a ruler of the synagogue who was an official appointed by the elders to look after the building, its contents, and its arrangements for worship. Jairus was a publicly recognized and respected figure, a very important part of this gospel. Therefore, he had a very high level of both social and religious status. The next part of the text is also very important, where Jairus approaches Jesus, and St. Luke tells us, falling at Jesus' feet, he besought him to come to his house. This shows us that someone with this high level of public respect, was not afraid to humble himself publicly. This would have been an ideal opportunity for Jesus to heal Jairus' daughter before she died and show a great lesson of humility. However, this event seems to have been interrupted by a surprising distraction. As Jesus went, the people pressed round him, and a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her flow of blood ceased. Emphasizing that word, immediately. What may seem like a distraction to the story in the midst of a conversation between the ruler of the synagogue and Jesus ends up, in fact, being a crucial part of the message of Jesus. The gospel tells us of two people. One is a man whose name we know, Jairus, and whose occupation we know as a very prestigious one, is publicly recognized socially and religiously. You couldn't really get higher on the social status in the time of Jesus. The second is a woman who has a disease that, according to the Mosaic law, was considered unclean and unfit for contact with other people. Therefore, the other extreme of society, the lowest status in society. Unlike Jairus, who speaks to Jesus on a one-to-one basis, she appears in a crowd. Another very important contrast. We do not know her name, and Jesus did not even see her face to face when he healed her. This important contrast is emphasized over and over again in so many parts of the gospel. In fact, it is emphasized again in the later part of the gospel, where we realize that Jairus was also married and had a family. She probably had been abandoned by her family because of her sickness. This is one of the many social and religious contrasts that St. Luke makes to emphasize that despite the social and religious categories we put people in, Jesus sees everyone with absolute equal dignity and respect. Although Jesus healing her is extraordinary, the further level of extraordinariness is that Jesus leaves Jairus. He leaves Jairus' request and gives priority to a miracle for an unknown and an outcast woman. We cannot overlook these details because, in addition to this being a random healing account, it in fact teaches us a greater lesson that we all stand equally before God. We may create categories for ourselves and for others, but the gospel of today tells us that God does not. We may think that some are more worthy of God's love and mercy, but today's gospel tells us, and Jesus manifests, exactly how God sees every single one of us with equal dignity and honor. Jesus, in fact, tells us in Matthew chapter 11, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." When we hear this word all, do we realize that it applies to all, every single one of us, regardless of what stage we are in our life, regardless of where we are, regardless of how others may think of us, either in a high state or a low state. By the end of the gospel, Jesus heals the woman and brings back to life Jairus' daughter. When we hear this gospel, do we think this is ordinary, extraordinary, or extraordinariness? The gospel illuminates God's love. The gospel brings to life how Jesus' every action is a manifestation of God's mercy. The gospel also reminds us to welcome God's love and mercy in our life and to extend it to the life of everyone around us. When we do this, We will appreciate how Jesus made the extraordinary ordinary and how he teaches us to make the ordinary very extraordinary.